it might be rational to pay a certain cost to maintain the freedom to roam. But when you start to talk about potentially waging a world war scale conflict, you have to ask, is the freedom to roam worth it?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Security Dilemma, a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. I'm A.J. Manuzzi, joined by my co-host John Allen Gay, as we have a conversation with John Schuessler. Dr. Schuessler is Associate Professor in the Department of International Affairs, as well as co-director of the Albritton Center for Grand Strategy at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Previously, he taught at the Air War College, and he received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He is the author of Deceit on the Road to War, Presidents, Politics, and American Democracy. He's also been chair of the Foreign Policy section of the American Political Science Association, and his primary interests include democracy and war, as well as American grand strategy. Let's jump right into our conversation with John Schuessler.
Dr. Schuessler, welcome to Security Dilemma. Perhaps we can begin with a big picture question. You're a scholar of U.S. grand strategy and an esteemed one at that. What about U.S. foreign policy is most confounding or frustrating to you at the present moment?
Well, I think at the present moment, maybe a reluctance to face up to trade-offs. I'm sure this is a perpetual complaint of everybody involved in the foreign policy or grand strategy debate at a professional level. On the one hand, I think we're all attracted to clear arguments that draw out clear contrasts, so we can figure out where we fit in the landscape. On the other hand, sometimes these arguments are clearer than the truth, and it leads us to kind of stake our ground on all or nothing positions that don't really capture the complexity of the matter. So, like everybody, I think I would like to see more grappling with real trade-offs and less posturing.
Yeah, it seems like we're often hesitant, one, to acknowledge that trade-offs exist, because I think in Washington that requires a sense of hierarchy among our interests, and that's uncomfortable. I don't think anybody wants to be, the third most important region, or to say, well, Ambassador so-and-so, your country isn't as important as these other 5 countries. But then it's also interesting that you see trade-offs not being discussed in practice. I was talking with someone earlier today about the, some of the recent rounds of the National Defense Strategy have admirably included a sense of hierarchy among our interests. They're like, okay, China and Russia are our top threats, or China and then Russia, and then a number of other things. And so in theory, we're prioritizing, but then in practice, for instance, if you were to look at the back half of the Biden administration, despite having some of the officially the clearest prioritization that China is the number one threat, they were flowing a lot of forces into the Middle East and into Europe, which were nominally deprioritized. So yeah, prioritization and trade-offs are kind of a disease in Washington.
Speaking of grand strategy and trade-offs, I want to get to this article that you wrote, 2022 in Parameters. It's a thought-provoking piece called Ambivalent Offshore Balancer, America in the Middle East and Beyond. First, we talk a lot about the concept of offshore balancing here in the policy and grand strategy kind of community in Washington and in the academy. How would you describe offshore balancing as a concept just to our listeners?
I think it's most succinctly captured in the phrase balancer of last resort. So the crucial point is that if you are an offshore balancer, your first preference is actually to, quote, buck pass. So the balancing part of offshore balancing is a bit misleading. What you'd like to do is to pass the buck to frontline states in a region of interest to contain a threat on their own. You might help them at the margins, perhaps with some military aid or diplomatic backing or something like that, but you really would like to lead from behind, to use an Obama-era phrase. And only if those local efforts fail or are insufficient do you want to come in and provide a lot of the balancing muscle, whether that's, direct military intervention or industrial, mobilization or something like that.
How does that work? Like, what mechanisms does it rely on? Because the critique you will hear in Washington of some of these, balancing theories where you're relying on frontline states and on regional states to contain aggressors that might threaten our interests is like, well, these things don't happen without American leadership.
That's fair, but I would argue that's a failure to take the strategy seriously on its own terms. For offshore balancing to have any bite, you have to have some appetite for risk, because this is all broadly informed by realist IR theory. If you want frontline states to balance themselves, they need to kind of credibly get the message that they're on their own, at least initially. And so you need to be willing to risk them being on their own, at least initially. I think there is a faith in offshore balancing, that balance of power politics will operate. So if you say to Japan, you're going to have to take the lead in East Asia to deal with the rising China, Japanese leaders will not throw up their hands and immediately submit to China's will when left, to their own devices. They will make some effort to protect their vital interests.
Part of what you get at in the piece is about this idea of the stopping power of water, kind of originally popularized by John Mearsheimer. And it's been posed that the way large bodies of water inherently inhibit power projection and make global hegemony difficult to achieve, force would-be hegemons to settle for becoming the biggest power in their region, potentially, if that. Many say that this explains why the US is content to be a regional hegemon while it steps into other regions only as the balance of power is threatened and comes into question. But in the piece, you argue that the stopping power of water may actually allow the US to tolerate another regional hegemon if offshore balancing actually becomes too costly. Why do you think that is, and what considerations should inform policymakers whether balancing is too costly?
Yeah. So I should just tell our listeners up front that Mearsheimer was my dissertation advisor at the University of Chicago, and as often happens, you're socialized into a set of ideas and you chew on them over many years and figure out what you think. So in this case, Mearsheimer had to introduce this concept of the stopping power of water in order to explain why his theory, which says that great powers should maximize their power broadly, can also explain why the United States stopped short of going for global hegemony, given that theory. And the stopping power of water explains that, as you pointed out, AJ. I think my feeling is that perhaps Mearsheimer didn't take the stopping power of water seriously enough in certain respects, and I think he appreciates this at some level. And the key problem is in the rationale for offshore balancing. So, in this case, the United States is kind of committed to maintaining the balance of power in other important regions, lest a regional hegemon emerge in one of them. But if you look at the threat that regional hegemon would pose to the US, it's limited by the stopping power of water. So what Mearsheimer ends up arguing is that, well, given this stopping power of water, another regional hegemon could not pose a direct threat to the United States in terms of invasion or conquest, but it could, quote, meddle in the Western Hemisphere or other regions, just as the United States can meddle in other regions now. This is captured in the concept of freedom to roam. So, according to his argument, the United States wants to remain the sole regional hegemon so that it is free to roam, but others are not. And the response I make in this piece is it might be rational to pay a certain cost to maintain the freedom to roam. But when you start to talk about potentially waging a world war scale conflict, you have to ask, is the freedom to roam worth it? This is a hard question to get your head around because the United States has been free to roam for a long time. well before any of us were born. And so thinking about a world where the United States did not have unfettered freedom to roam is challenging. But I think these are the kinds of hard questions we need to be asking at a fundamental level to kind of pin down American interests.
In your title of your piece and the region you look at in great detail, and it is the Middle East, you argue that while it may be preferable for Washington to prevent Iranian regional hegemony, the U.S. could be secure even if Iran does become a regional hegemon. In your estimation, do you think Iran is capable today of becoming a regional hegemon?
And just to maybe piggyback on that, why should we not be that concerned by
Yeah.
the prospect, like even if it is realizable, of Iranian regional hegemony, in your view?
Yeah, both good questions. I should say, just for context, I don't do a lot of my thinking about the Middle East per se, but this piece was commissioned, if you will, by a group at Oxford who was running a very useful workshop on retrenchment from the Middle East, and that's why I chose to focus on the Middle East in the article. So I don't want to give off any pretensions to regional expertise that are not there. That said, my understanding from a survey of the relevant literature is Iran is not really a candidate for regional hegemony. It certainly wasn't when the article was written, and even less since the events of October 7th and beyond in the region. So, in many respects, if you had to survey the major regions and ask, where is regional hegemony most a live issue, I would put East Asia, at the top, maybe the Middle East in the middle, depending on how things go over the next several years, and probably Europe maybe at the bottom. But so no, I don't think Iran's, prospects for regional hegemony are good. If anybody's interested, Joshua Rovner has an excellent treatment of this issue in an edited volume by Charles Glazer and Rose Kalanick on oil and its effect on American grand strategy. I would look to Josh's discussion of this to see why Iran might not be a prime candidate. As far as the second question, the Middle East is a bit different from the other regions we normally focus on in terms of why you would be worried about a regional hegemon. Normally, what we're worried about is that regional hegemon, again, being free to roam. So if it's dominating its region, it's very powerful and it doesn't have local threats to worry about. It can mobilize some of that power and and become free to roam. So meddle in other regions, including the Western Hemisphere. I don't think that was ever the concern with any kind of Iranian hegemony, that they would project power into other regions. It really, I think, was more specifically about the oil weapon, which, again, we should take seriously. I think it's a qualitatively different kind of issue, but I think the concern was that Iran could, like any Middle Eastern hegemon, could leverage the oil weapon to coerce or harm American or Western interests more broadly.
I know you talked a little bit about Asia as perhaps the best candidate for a potential regional hegemon. Could you walk us through that a little bit and what perhaps is a mitigating factor that perhaps prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon?
Right. So, I mean, for starters, China is the kind of candidate potential hegemon. I doubt there's too much ambiguity about that. But I think that the main factor I would point to is China's great latent power. That's another term that Mearsheimer, uses in his book Tragedy of Great Power Politics. So, even I think at the peak of its power, the Soviet Union was about as third as wealthy as the United States at best, I think. And China has the potential to be wealthier, the potential, and has a very large population. So I think there's a sense that China could generate much more power than the Soviet Union in the past. It's also, yes, very far away from the United States. So, it's difficult for us to put together a balancing coalition in the region when we have to travel a long distance And there are long distances between our local allies to kind of encircle China and keep its influence contained. I think there's also a sense that China, because of its large economy, just has more influence in many ways, especially in its neighborhood, than the Soviet Union did in some respects, because there's potentially so much dependence on it economically, both in the region and beyond. I think if there's a mitigating factor, again, it's just the sheer difficulty of projecting military power over distance and water. The stopping power of water does operate, in both directions. And so, just as it might make it very difficult for the United States to help defend Taiwan, it also makes it difficult for China to project power over Taiwan, let alone over Japan or the Philippines. And then, of course, nuclear weapons, which are kind of, always lurk in the background as a constraint on expansion. So I'd say those are the factors that are pushing in either direction. I should also add that, we are assuming that China is, quote, interested in regional hegemony. There have been smart arguments made that China should not be interested and will not be interested. Jonathan Kirshner, in his recent book on classical realism, says attempts at regional hegemony are the one sure route to destruction for a great power, with the exception of the United States. Charles Glazer, among others, has argued that China could remain very secure short of regional hegemony, provided some accommodation is reached on issues that immense concern like Taiwan.
In light of all of this, do you think that offshore balancing can work as a viable grand strategy in today's world?
I think it very well could. In my own work, I am trying to extend the logic that we talked about in this article about ambivalent balancing into a broader case for something called isolationism, which is a terrible word, but it's the only word we have to describe a grand strategic position that basically the US could live with another regional hegemon. The reason we need that position to be articulated is that everybody to the right of isolationists believes otherwise. So I do think someone needs to make the case for this. Now, that said, offshore balancing could be perfectly viable if the cards all flip out the right way. So, for example, in East Asia, if China is not interested in regional hegemony, or if it's interested but the constraints on power projection are too great, or the distribution of power remains stable, or if the local states kick up their balancing efforts, you could see offshore balancing be perfectly viable. That is, the United States could help, lead from behind, and the balance of power could be maintained in the region at a fairly reasonable cost. The reason I think we need some thinking about an isolationist alternative, again, I wish there were a better word, is that if worse comes to worse, and China is in a position to make a serious run at regional hegemony, if you are an offshore balancer and you are consistent, you have to be willing to potentially fight China to stop that. And by my reckoning, that's when the costs of balancing escalate dramatically, especially with nuclear weapons in the mix. So, to go back to where we started, just thinking through trade offs, even at a highly abstract level, you have to start thinking about the trade offs between preventing a Chinese hegemon and the immense potential cost of doing that. It's a tough problem.
Yeah, well, and I think I'm not a big fan of the I word either. I think things like restraint or not aspiring to hegemony are often a much better way to describe on the basis that isolationism has meant many things over the course of American history, but I think that a lot of people associate it with the 1920s and 1930s, where it manifested not only with a very strong disengagement from Europe, to the point that if you look at the Neutrality Acts, they were a reversal of centuries of American policy designed to preserve our right to trade during conflict. It was actually trying to make it illegal to trade in a lot of ways during conflict. And then at the same period, you also had high tariffs. You had an you had a significantly more restrictive immigration policy. That it represented a kind of broader inward turn, which I don't think is what most folks who favor the U.S. taking a big step back from running the global security system as it tries to do now. I don't think a lot of folks would support that kind of more full-bodied 1920s, 1930s style exit from all things international. But I did want to, kind of zoom in on that offshore issue because, I think it was in one of your articles that I read this, but there was definitely an article recently that talked about, to my mind, a fundamental tension of credibility for offshore balancing, namely that if you get to this point where you're actually about to be called on to balance because a regional hegemon is being established, fighting plausible regional hegemons is extremely costly. And if you actually kind of have an alternative, even an unpleasant one, thanks to the stopping power of water, thanks to your own national resources, that you're probably going to choose that alternative. In other words, that offshore balancing is not like a stable or serious school at the level of theory, because it faces this fundamental tension between paying extreme cost to balance or paying extreme costs to just skip balancing and tolerate a hegemon, and that the costs of skipping balancing are probably lower.
I think that's right. And I mean, this gets to a more general issue, which is that we in the realism and restraint community have been able to finesse all this because we have been united around, I think, an important set of arguments that the United States overreached in the post Cold War period and over intervened in parts of the world where that intervention was not warranted. And that allowed a lot of people who maybe disagreed on some of these questions about regional hegemons and balancing to remain united. And what struck me as I've surveyed the literature is, we create these fine distinctions between restrainers and offshore balancers, but I have not found a lot of disagreement among them that the United States should prevent the emergence of other regional hegemons. It's just that restrainers, I think, tend to be more sanguine, I would call it, that the balance of power will stick and that the United States will not be called upon to actually balance, or it's a low likelihood, and that if it was called on, it would be late in the game. And I'm not calling anybody's credibility into question. It's more just saying, okay, but at the limit, you are now on record agreeing with the offshore balancers that this is something the United States would have to do if the situation called on it. Yeah, isolationism is a terrible word because of all the baggage, but what is the name for the position that's to the left of that, if you will? The one that actually the United States might be able to tolerate another regional hegemon. It's that position that I would say is underarticulated in the debate. And so it's not that I think offshore balancing is internally inconsistent or not tenable. It's more like I don't think people have really recognized that the balancing trumps all at the end of the day. And if it does, all the appeal that's gone with that position in terms of its cost effectiveness starts to go away.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, as someone who sits in Washington and talks to people all day, I feel like offshore balancing has a certain political logic to it as well, namely that it's saying, well, this isn't a radical change from current American ways of thinking about international security, because it's still saying that Europe matters a lot, Asia matters a lot, the Middle East matters some amount that's meaningfully large, and therefore it's not as serious of a challenge to Washington, which I still think it's a very serious challenge to the way Washington does business. But it feels a little more salon-fähig than some of the more traditional forms of restraint that you might see out there.
Yes, I agree completely. And to be frank, I mean, for a good part of my career, I was perfectly content with offshore balancing. I wrote a piece with a friend, Sebastian Rosado, in 2010 about a quote, realist foreign policy for America. And the headline there was, well, any realist should want a balance. So I guess what I would say is one of the virtues of the realism and restraint community is we have the space to work out some of these arguments amongst each other. And it's hard to say what's going to end up practically mattering because, a lot goes into that. But it's struck me over the last several years that we have not thought through this issue as deeply as we might, the kind of other regional hegemons question, if you will.
I am very interested in the political element of this as well that John was kind of alluding to. Do you think a realist grand strategy can survive the political pressures of the American system? And what kinds of challenges might it face?
That's a great question. And I'm sure you could devote a year of episodes to this. Maybe just a few, hopefully not banal observations. Probably the first thing we cover in my American Grand Strategy is the difference between theory and practice. So, in practice, I'm not sure any grand strategy survives first contact in the sense that, as your listeners surely know, we live in a democracy with fragmented powers and the pulling and shaping of politics. And so the notion that you're going to have kind of some coherent strategy that's implemented from the top down is fairly fanciful, although I do think certain logics of behavior emerge organically. As far as a realist strategy in particular, as John Mearsheimer and many others, George Kennan, have pointed out, these ideas are a bit alien to American political culture and always will be. The notion that the United States, that its prime role in the world is to maintain the balance of power, as opposed to, I'd say, taking care of Americans narrowly. So nationalism certainly has some bite, but there's some overlap with realism, but it's not perfect. Or the liberal strain that the United States is kind of the linchpin of a wider order that provides peace and prosperity to all. That comes a bit more naturally. So I think there's always going to be a fair amount of pressure on any set of realist ideas in the system. And again, part of this is on us as realists. I do think we enjoy our our minority status. We're speaking truth to power and we're eternally beleaguered and nobody likes us. I think there's a certain pride there. I think this is where structure is important. If you're a good realist, you really do believe that after a point the external world forces you, or at least encourages certain kinds of behaviors. I think the US is shaped by structure less than other countries and great powers, but it has a bit of effect. And because of that, even with our discomfort with realism, we do realist things when we really have to. So that's probably what matters to me the most.
Yeah, this question of like how realism relates to politics, kind of as you were saying, is something you could go into for ages because like there's a strain of realist thought that you see in folks like Morgenthau that's very skeptical that democracies can have a good foreign policy being a realist foreign policy. That basically like, hey, publics are easily stirred up toward kind of manias of enmity for a particular country, or that making some sort of sensible switch between one alliance to another or one enmity to another is not something that the public and representative government that's in close contact with the public can do easily. You can't have the moment like in 1984 where they just switch who they're at war with overnight and say that the posters for the old war were put up by saboteurs. That there's a much more robust set of feelings. I think there's also another big structural problem in politics of where there's concentrated benefits or concentrated interest in a particular policy, where the broader public maybe doesn't like that policy, but is not really going to be active. If 10% of the population woke up tomorrow and said they agree with Pythagoras that it's wrong to eat beans, I would bet pretty soon you would have like beans not be in federal school lunches. If millions of people were calling their congressmen saying, why do you have these poor legumes being devoured by our school children? And you see this kind of thing play out in foreign policy. Here in Virginia, there's been movements to have the Sea of Japan in textbooks also labeled as the EC, that you have. And I mean, the United States has like basically every different country's diaspora has a population here, sometimes concentrated in like one particular area where, there's a lot of influence on those representatives. So like there's a lot of interests in various places. And then there's also structural interests that are very similar in, for instance, having a high defense budget. That they're economically, defense is not the best way to like stimulate the economy, but there's a lot of people who benefit from a relatively high defense budget because they're the ones involved in that economic activity. And so it matters a lot to them.
Those are all well put. And I guess the point I would add is that the fact that all these domestic influences kind of regularly seep into policy is a symptom of a good thing, which is that, again, I would say the United States is relatively a free and secure place. This is kind of, geopolitics 101, but relatively weak neighbors, insulated by the oceans. We just don't have to grapple with what I would call pressing geopolitical challenges the way that others do, like Ukraine or South Korea or, Israel or Saudi Arabia. So this is a luxury, but it does mean when structure is not impinging as strongly, you can have more free play for ideology and interest groups and all these things. So, on realist grounds, you have to be fairly tolerant of distortions, I would say, in American foreign policy. I think where you start to get nervous is when those, when structure is really bearing down, then you have to become smarter, but potentially also more regimented, which is, uncomfortable in a free society.
We just had earlier this week, actually, Jeremy Shapiro of the European Council on Foreign Relations walk us through some of the predominant strains of GOP foreign policy at the moment. Basically, three distinct tribes of prioritizers, primacists, and restrainers. You've also done some work on categorizing more broadly the various constituencies that, I guess primarily in this case, that comprise the restraint community on both the left and the right. Could you walk our listeners through some of the different perspectives that are represented and some of the fault lines that may emerge?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think you're referring to an article that I co-authored with Jason Castillo here at Texas A&M, and then Miranda Priebe and Brian Rooney at RAND, called Competing Visions of Restraint, which is an homage to Barry Posen and Andrew Ross's Competing Visions of U.S. Grand Strategy from the mid-90s.
Classic article.
Oh, yes, and it will always be a classic. So we've already talked about one group of restrainers, realist restrainers. And as we talked about, as a realist, the more you feel that the balance of power is stable in another region, the more restrained you can be. So there are people, for example, who, to be very practical, would say, okay, look at the war in Ukraine. This has revealed that, Russia is weaker than we thought and certainly doesn't pose a hegemonic threat to Europe. That should allow the United States to be, quote, fairly restrained in Europe on realist grounds. Whereas maybe you can be less restrained in East Asia if China is more of a hegemonic threat, as we talked about. I think you could be most restrained then on realist grounds, potentially in the Middle East, where Iran might have the weakest prospects for regional hegemony and even weaker maybe than we thought after, suffering so many setbacks in its competition with Israel. Again, you can rank the regions differently, but that's the thinking. That's the realist version of restraint. Now, there are a lot of realists in the academy. There are several in the think tank circuit who think broadly in realist terms, but obviously the political center of gravity in our system, kind of resides with the parties and with the ideologies that animate them. So equally important, if not more so, are the other two camps of restrainers, the conservative camp and the progressive camp. Let me say a word about the conservative camp of restrainers. This was kind of my charge in the article, was to make sense of this, and it was very challenging because when I started work on this, I was primarily familiar with libertarians who make very clear arguments on conservative grounds why you would want to be restrained abroad. And it has to do with fears of a garrison state at home, which are long-standing fears that if you pursue an overly ambitious foreign policy abroad, it will kind of feed the state at home in the form of especially an overweening executive branch. Too high taxes, too much intervention in the economy, too much power in a military industrial complex, as we were talking about a bit before, with special interests and so on and so forth. I think there is another group of conservative restrainers that I don't think shares the libertarians' commitment to liberty, I guess, as a first principle, and that is the nationalists. And this is, I mean, nationalists have always been with us, but obviously this group or this thinking is more prominent on the right than it was before, I would say. And for nationalists, it's not that it, I mean, I don't think there's zero interest in liberty. It's just that their primary interest is in the well-being of the American nation, defined in kind of popular terms, the people, and they do not want the United States to be helping others, I think, unnecessarily when it could be helping Americans. And there's a strong economic dimension as well that has to do with globalization and offshoring and the erosion of the manufacturing base. But a lot of it has to do with, I mean, again, to use Ukraine, why are we spending our hard earned tax dollars helping Ukrainians when, we have these problems here at home that deserve our attention first? So I think that those are the two strands of restraint on the right that are most prominent. And then finally, on the progressive left, I think the animating idea is this notion that actually the United States has plenty of reasons to be engaged abroad because Americans are better off in a world that's more equal economically, where climate change is taken more seriously, where there's less autocracy or oligarchy abroad. But military tools, forward presence, extended deterrence, all this is kind of beside the point. We have all these other things, all these other ways of engaging diplomatically and economically that should be taking precedence. And in fact, by investing so much in military tools, we kind of undermine our ability to kind of work with others, as a kind of democratic progressive ally to make common cause around some of these more, these broader challenges.
You've often talked about China as kind of a fault line on this issue, or where, some of the maybe more nationalist folks are a little willing to go a little bit further than especially folks on like the progressive left. What does a restraint approach to China look like versus like an offshore balancing approach?
Yeah, maybe let me address each part of that a bit in sequence. So I think the term that we use at least at one point is China as a stress test for all kinds of restrainers. And what I mean is, on realist grounds, you might have reasons to be restrained, but if China is the most plausible potential hegemon, those same realist beliefs might lead you to be less restrained over time. So the more plausible the hegemonic threat China poses, the harder it is on realist grounds to remain restrained about that threat. Likewise, if you're a conservative, the more plausible the Chinese threat to American liberties or to kind of American national prestige, if you will, or American strength, the harder it is on nationalist grounds to be restrained toward China. And then finally, on the progressive side, the more clearly China threatens democratic progressive values in the region and beyond, the more difficult it is to be restrained. So I guess that's it. Really is a stress test for everybody on the restraint side. What a restrained position on China looks like versus an offshore balancing one. I think in practice today, it has to do with when you think the balancing of China needs to start in earnest. People like John Mearsheimer that are associated with the offshore balancing label are kind of ready to have started the balancing yesterday. So, in his mind, China poses enough of a potential hegemonic threat to do a number of things that look like, the containment of China diplomatically, militarily, economically. Whereas I think others to the left of Mearsheimer in the strength community are willing to give it more time. Are we sure China wants regional hegemony? Does it have a realistic shot at getting it? In the meantime, does it make sense to potentially unnecessarily antagonize China by drawing a line through Taiwan, for example, which China thinks of as a domestic issue? Are we going to shoot ourselves in the foot economically by decoupling too much or engaging in some kind of trade war? There's just more room for those questions among those to the left of Mearsheimer and other offshore balancers in the restraint community.
In a piece you wrote for MSNBC not that long ago, you described Trump's second term foreign policy as likely to fall somewhere between realism and restraint this time around. What do you mean by that?
That's a fair question. And, after we wrote the longer article, Competing Visions of Restraint, and around the time Trump was elected again, obviously your attention turns to what are restraints prospects in another Trump administration. And, I wish we could stake out a crystal clear position, but I think our genuine feeling was that restraints prospects are uncertain. Part of this has to do with just, typical Beltway politics, I think. Trump is a singular figure, but he does have a coalition of support that is in some ways broad and varied. And so, when it came time to fill key foreign policy positions, you could see it's hard to kind of draw one ideological through line all those appointments. Marco Rubio at the State Department, or Pete Hegseth at Defense, or Michael Waltz at the National Security Council. Can you tell a coherent story, pro or anti restraint, that ties all those appointments together? I think it's very difficult. But on ideological grounds, I think there's a reason for this. And I look forward to listening to the Jeremy Shapiro episode. It's because there are different camps represented on the conservative side. I do think restraint as a practical matter has more of an opening than it's had in the past in a second Trump administration, but it's competing with other voices. And that's before we get to structure. There's a real world out there. China is rising or continues to rise in certain respects and may become more assertive on certain issues like Taiwan. We're not sure yet. The war in Ukraine has not been resolved. The Middle East, the peace there, if you will, is fragile. And so, whether restraint has a chance to make any progress depends a lot on how those issues play out. That said, I think one point we try to underline a few times in different fora is that to the extent there's some agreement, which we think there is, that East Asia does deserve some priority in theory over the other regions, you should see maybe more movement on Europe policy and Middle East policy than you did in the past. I think for a while restrainers were a bit fatalistic that anything was ever going to change, that it would be deep engagement in perpetuity in all three of the core regions. But I do sense that we could see some genuine change, some push toward more European autonomy in Europe. And I think the Middle East is a wild card just because even among some of these restraint types, there's a lot of antipathy toward Iran. But I do think there's more opening for restraint in those regions than there has been in the past.
Speaking of Europe, you had an article back in 2019 about NATO and the history of kind of the US approach to NATO, especially in the early days of the alliance, possible threats of abandonment directed at European states that weren't doing what we want. What lessons should current policymakers be taking?
It's a great question. So, since that article came out, more recently, Mark Trachtenberg, a noted historian who provided a lot of fodder for that article that Josh Shiprinson and I did, has published his own essay with the Cato Institute on, I think, on life after NATO in Europe, that I think is a good read for everybody out there to continue the story. But I think the basic lesson or point we would make is yes, in some ways, Trump is a departure from his predecessors. But in terms of dangling the threat of abandonment in order to get Europeans to assume more of the burden of defense, he is not singular in that respect. He's a bit blunter about it and does, says the quiet part out loud. But even there, if you go back to the John Foster Dulles agonizing reappraisal speech. That was public. There have been some moments where there's been real angst expressed at the highest levels about the balance of burdens in the alliance. I believe it was Secretary of Defense's Gates, his final speech under Obama, where he basically said, if the Europeans don't start carrying more of the weight, this NATO's not going to survive. That did not get the same reception as Trump's rhetoric, but this is all part of a piece. So I think the lesson of that piece is one does not want to be a bully for being a bully's sake, but our alliances should be treated as means at some level rather than sacrosanct ends. We shouldn't hesitate to kind of say when our vital interests are not being respected in those alliances.
You once wrote a book on how presidents manipulate public opinion around war. What were your findings? I mean, you used the word deceit.
I
I'm
did.
charitable by saying manipulate. Deceit is the word that you use in the title.
Right, but not lying. So that was one of the key findings is that the three cases I looked at, FDR and the run up to World War II, LBJ and the Americanization of the Vietnam War, and George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq, in each case, the president engaged in deceit. So usually the most important forms of deceit are what's not said or the spin that's put on what is said, as opposed to outright lying. And in each case, what I was focused on was the lengths that these presidents went to preempt debate about the courses of action they were steering us towards. So I think Franklin Roosevelt had the stiffest incentives to do this. There was simply very little appetite for an open declaration of war against the Axis prior to Pearl Harbor. And actually, if there were any hint that that's what he was looking for, there would have been a firestorm of criticism, even as American involvement in the war ratcheted up in his direction. But I think the same basic dynamic, applied in the other cases. And in the Iraq one, I think there was more debate, ironically, than the first two, but that was mainly because Bush was kind of pushing on an open door after 9/11, and there just wasn't the scrutiny of his claims that you might have expected otherwise. So I think what I was interested in that book was basically identifying a tension between the demands of democracy and the demands of statecraft and sussing out how presidents have managed that. And as a work of social science, I tried not to be too judgy. A lot comes down to, was the war that resulted necessary or successful? FDR has really been forgiven for a lot because World War II is seen as the good war. LBJ and George W. Bush, much less so, because those wars did not go well. So I guess again, to return to where we started, in my heart, I'm very interested in these kinds of tough trade-offs. I don't believe that all good things go together. And I think in a democracy, in a good sense, it's difficult to get a country to go to war. And that forces leaders to be indirect in how they do it.
Yeah, take our listeners through the FDR case a bit, because this is something that, like you don't hear about in high school. It's pretty much just like, oh yeah, Japan and the United States had some tension and then Japan attacked us.
Right. And unfortunately, to the extent you do hear some of it on the fringes, they are, I will call them, rather wild conspiracy theories about, FDR purposefully allowing the fleet in the Pacific to be attacked at Pearl Harbor. This is the famous backdoor theory of war. And I think the truth of the matter is it's somewhere in between. The United States was certainly not passive or completely a victim in this process, this entry into World War II. There was some, there were some active efforts being made to implicate the United States in the war while not being fully transparent about it. The two I focus on in the book and in a previous article are the undeclared war in the Atlantic. So the increasingly active efforts to ensure supplies got to first the British and then the Soviets so they could stay in the fight against Nazi Germany. And the important part here is that everybody was aware that in order to do this, eventually the United States is going to be firing at German ships and submarines that are trying to stop those shipments. And, there are people on the record, including FDR, saying, well, good. I mean, if there is some shooting, then that might finally galvanize the American people into this kind of recognition that we can't stay out of this war forever. That to me was rather shocking. And then, other historians have tried to kind of minimize the import of some of these comments, but it's hard for me to dismiss them. The Pacific is actually the more important part of the story. And there, the key change is in July of 1941, when the United States goes from, I would say, being very reluctant to fully cutting off the Japanese economically, especially from oil, because there was this recognition that if you do that, it might spur them into an act of aggression in Southeast Asia, to a willingness to cut them off completely. And in fact, there was a broad expectation into the fall of 1941 that it was a matter of time before Japan attacked somewhere. The shock was that the attack happened at Pearl Harbor. And the great counterfactual is, if Japan had confined its attacks to Southeast Asia, could FDR have kind of gotten a declaration of war through? And we just don't know. As far as why we made this change as a country, probably the best argument, I tend to argue that FDR I'll use this word, was resigned to the U.S. getting into World War II, and it was not worth making any effort to stop that. And so, let's just, I guess, nudge the process along in the Pacific and the Atlantic. We're going to be in anyway. That's my argument. Another argument is basically that this was a way to draw Japan south so that it didn't attack north when the Soviets were in tough straits against the Nazis on the Eastern Front. I can't do full justice to all the nuances here, but that's roughly what's covered in the book.
Dr. Schuessler, thank you for coming on Security Dilemma.
This has been a great discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Security Dilemma is a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. To learn more about our programs, visit our website at jqas.org. Remember to rate and review on your podcast app and join us every Tuesday for new episodes of Security Dilemma.